All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to the Silk Road Explained, where we're going to completely shatter a few common misconceptions about ancient history. When you hear the Silk Road, you probably picture a string of camels slowly hauling these luxurious, shimmering fabrics across a vast desert. But the truth is infinitely more complex, and honestly, way more fascinating.
So, how did a fish bladder, a flea, and a tiny seed build the modern world? I know, it sounds exactly like the setup to a weird joke, but I promise you it's not. By the end of this explainer, you're going to see exactly how these seemingly insignificant microelements triggered this massive chain reaction that literally forged the world we live in today.
Section 1. More than just silk. The Silk Road was absolutely not just some ancient shopping mall for luxury goods. Think of it more like a world-building engine of biological, technological, and cultural exchange. For thousands of years, across this massive 10,000-kilometer stretch of Eurasia, human beings were unknowingly trading the very blueprints of civilization. I mean, we're talking about weapons that broke empires, ideas that sparked total revolutions, and biology that both sustained and, tragically, wiped out millions of people. Section 2. Weapons that built empires. Let's look at the first major catalyst for global change, which, surprisingly, didn't start in a bustling market, but out on the battlefield. The domino effect of cavalry evolution is just staggering. First, you have the domestication of horses on the Eurasian steppes thousands of years ago. But simply riding a horse isn't enough, right? You need step 2, the composite recurved bow. This was a weapon compact enough to swing right over a horse's neck, but powerful enough to punch straight through armor. But then, how do you arm an entire cavalry unit? You need identical, reliable ammunition. That brings us to step 3, socketed bronze arrowheads cast in molds. This allowed for the mass production of perfectly weighted, identical arrows. And finally, step 4, the stirrup. This anchored the rider to their horse, letting them absorb the massive shock of a lance charge without just being thrown right into the dirt. Step by step, these tech leaps birthed the most terrifying military forces the ancient world had ever seen, completely leveling superpowers from the Romans to the Chinese. But wait, remember that fish bladder we talked about at the start? Here's where it comes in. The recurved bow was incredibly powerful because it was a composite made of wood, horn, and animal sinew, but that extreme tension constantly wanted to rip the whole bow apart. Some unknown ancient genius discovered that boiling a sturgeon swim bladder created this phenomenally strong, viscous glue. That tiny, bizarre biological ingredient is what held the world-conquering recurved bow together. It was a technological breakthrough of immense consequences that literally enabled horse archers to conquer the known world. And the undisputed masters of this type of warfare were, for sure, the Mongols. In the 13th century, their mounted armies conquered everything from the Sea of Japan all the way to Poland. But ironically, their conquest resulted in the Pax Mongolica, a period of Mongol-enforced peace. They were completely ruthless in war, but they entirely pacified the Silk Road. Bandits were so terrified of Mongol soldiers that suddenly merchants, missionaries, and entirely new ideas were able to travel these intercontinental routes with unprecedented safety. Section 3. The Biological Highway. But humans and ideas weren't the only things traveling these safe new routes. Microscopic travelers were hitching rides with the merchants and armies, creating this extreme duality of biological exchange. On the life-giving side, we have crucial crops like Chinese broomcorn millet traveling all the way to Europe. But on the death-bringing side, we have fleas. Fleas carrying the bubonic plague, hitching rides on rats, and moving swiftly right along those exact same ancient trade routes. Let's start with the life-giving seed, 45. So what does that mean? It represents the incredibly fast 45-day growth cycle of broomcorn millet. This tiny little seed traveled all the way from China to the West, and because it grew so rapidly, European farmers realized they could plant it right after they harvested their main wheat crop. They could multi-crop. Getting 2 harvests from the exact same plot of land generated massive caloric surpluses. That meant not every single person had to farm anymore. This freed up labor and created the very first non-farming, specialized classes, metalworkers, priests, basically the foundational roles of complex civilization. But this biological highway also brought the Black Death, which tragically killed a third of Europe's population. We're talking at least 25 million people. However, that devastating population drop created a massive ripple effect. Suddenly, there was a severe shortage of manual labor. The surviving workers were able to demand higher wages, leading to less poverty and more food. But it also forced a desperate need for mechanization. Surviving Europeans literally had to invent incredible labor-saving devices just to keep society functioning.
We're talking spinning wheels, horizontal looms, fulling mills, blast furnaces, and highly efficient three-masted ships. The tragedy of the Black Death inadvertently kicked off this era of rapid mechanical invention and basically birthed the European middle class.
Section 4. Ideas, Paper, and Gunpowder. Now, as Europe grew wealthier, they naturally craved more from the East, seeking out the exports that would truly shatter the medieval world. And the journey of gunpowder? It's wild, because it actually started as a spectacular failure. Ancient Chinese alchemists mixed saltpeter and sulfur, hoping to create a magical elixir for eternal life. Ironically, they just wound up blowing their laboratory to pieces. But that deadly mixture evolved. We see the fire lance emerge by 950 CE. Then the Mongols adopted it, hurling exploding firebombs at cities. Finally, the technology traveled west to Europe. By the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the English were firing massive guns. The thunderous noise and smoke absolutely terrified the French, effectively ending the era of the armored European knight on horseback. And then there was paper. Before the Silk Road brought paper to the West, Europeans wrote on parchment made from animal skins. Imagine needing, actually, scratch that, up to 200 entire animal skins just to make one single book. It was impossibly expensive. Though, honestly, I'm sure the sheep of Europe were incredibly relieved when cheap, plant-based paper finally arrived. Paper made by mashing and boiling plant fibers or rags traveled from China into the Arab world, creating an intellectual golden age in places like Baghdad, and eventually made its way into Europe. Cheap paper completely democratized knowledge. It allowed artists to sketch, make mistakes, and discard ideas freely. It quite literally changed how humanity thought. But what happens when you combine that cheap paper with the printing press? Now, China had actually invented movable type centuries earlier, but Chinese printing was incredibly labor-intensive, requiring roughly 6,000 individual characters. When Johannes Gutenberg developed his press in Germany, he had a massive linguistic advantage. The Latin alphabet required only 26 individual letters. This simple difference made European printing infinitely more efficient. Books became incredibly cheap, they spread like wildfire, and it sparked an absolute intellectual explosion that directly fueled movements like the Protestant Reformation. Let's talk maritime tech for a second, which was also totally dominated by the East initially. To put this into perspective, just look at the staggering difference in scale here. In the 15th century, Chinese Admiral Zheng He commanded these unbelievable armadas. Chronicles state his treasure ships were 130 meters long. Fast forward all the way to the 19th century, and the greatest American and European clipper ships were only hitting around 102 meters. Eastern maritime dominance was staggering. But the Chinese court abruptly lost interest in seafaring, leaving this massive vacuum that Europe eagerly filled in their quest to find alternate routes for spices. Section 5. The Modern Silk Road. It is just wild to connect these dots and bring this historical ripple effect right up into our modern reality. That ancient Chinese gunpowder, born from a failed laboratory experiment, eventually made its way to 19th century America. Canal builders in New York hit this solid ledge of dolomite rock. Pick and shovel work would have taken decades, literally. Instead, they used massive quantities of gunpowder to blast the Erie Canal's deep cut. That engineering marvel unlocked global maritime commerce for the interior of the American continent, which directly turned New York City into the prototype for the globally connected modern megacity we know today. And the story of the Silk Road? It is far from over. $1 trillion. Let the sheer scale of that number sink in for a second. That is the estimated cost of China's modern One Belt, One Road initiative. Today, they're literally rebuilding this ancient trade network, aiming to connect 60 countries over land and sea, linking a third of the world's GDP. It's the ancient enterprise completely reborn for the 21st century. In this brand new network, it doesn't even stop at the Earth's atmosphere. Recently, a nanosatellite, literally named Silk Road 1, was launched into orbit just to provide navigation for this vast new network. Which brings us to our final thought for today. We started this whole thing with fish bladders and nomadic horse archers around the steppes, and now we're talking about multinational trillion-dollar networks and nanosatellites in space. So what will the next Silk Road bring? How is human connectivity going to evolve next? And what completely unexpected innovations will it spark? That's all for this explainer. Thanks so much for diving into this with me.